Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. On behalf of the Soeterbeeck programma and the Faculty of Philosophy, Theology and Religious Studies of Radboud University Nijmegen, I cordially welcome you to this Radboud lecture, which will be delivered by Dr. Karen Armstrong on compassion, nice idea or urgent global imperative. Compassion, nice idea or urgent global imperative. The Faculty of Philosophy, Theology and Religious Studies is one of the 7 faculties of Radboud University Nijmegen, which is a full-fledged university standing in the Catholic tradition. Within this academic environment, the faculty formulates as its mission to train young people to become engaged and critical academics who can take leadership positions in the society and reflect critically on philosophical and religious issues. And undoubtedly, compassion is certainly one of those issues. In the same spirit, the Soeterbeeck programma, which is the outreach program of Radboud University and linked to our faculty, tries to stimulate reflection and debate in the Dutch society. Therefore, I'm delighted that Dr. Karen Armstrong was willing to accept our invitation to speak to us tonight about compassion. After her very heavy schedule today, this afternoon she opened the House of Compassion in Nijmegen town, as you know, and this afternoon she also had a session with our students, a seminar with students. So thank you very much for that. I think that Dr. Karen Armstrong needs little introduction, as she is well known from her bestsellers, Muhammad, A Biography of the Prophet, 1992, A History of God, From Abraham to the Present, 1993, Jerusalem, One City, Three Faiths, 1996, and The Battle for God, 2000. In all her books, Dr. Armstrong takes an engaged and balanced position in the fierce debate on religion in the society. So once again, welcome Dr. Armstrong. We are extremely grateful that you accepted our invitation to speak to us tonight. The floor is yours. Sorry. Yeah?
Thank you very much, Dean. And it's a great pleasure to be with you here this evening. It's a great honor to be giving this lecture. Thank you. Well, in 2008, I heard I'd won the TED Prize. And TED give you some money, but more importantly, they give you a wish for a better world, which TED promised to try to make come true. And I knew almost immediately what it was that I wanted, because it had long been a source of frustration to me as a historian of religion that we hardly heard anything much about compassion. Every single one of the major world religions has developed an ideal of compassion, and each one has quite independently developed its own version of what's sometimes called the Golden Rule. Never treat others as you would not like to be treated yourself. And they have said that this, not a particular doctrine or a particular ethical practice, this is the test of true spirituality. And I had not really thought of religion in terms of compassion, because as a young woman, I'd experienced religion as a not very compassionate activity. But when I was studying and coming back to religion via my studies, I kept being brought by the dynamic of the subject back to the issue of compassion. Whether I was studying or writing a book, A History of God, or a history of Jerusalem, or a history of Islam, or a history of fundamentalism, I kept being brought back by the whole dynamic of the discussion to this issue. And it it became apparent to me as I looked around the world that unless we now implement the Golden Rule globally, so that we treat all nations, all peoples, without exception, as we would wish to be treated ourselves, the world will not be a viable place. Had we, British, for example, treated the people in our colonies as we would wish to be treated ourselves, we would not be having so many problems of a political nature today. And yet, often when religious leaders come together, that's not the message we hear. We hear about a certain doctrinal formulation or a particular pronouncement on some kind of question of sexual ethics, perhaps, but we don't hear about compassion. So I asked Ted to help me to create, craft, and propagate a charter for compassion. And it was written by 20 leading activists and thinkers representing 6 of the major world religions: Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, and Confucianism. And it was a sign that despite our many significant and interesting differences, on this we were all in agreement. And that at a time when the world often thinks of religion as the religions, as they call them, as being chronically at odds with one another, we could reach across the divide and work together for a better world. Well, we launched the charter. The charter is written, you can find it on www.charterforcompassion.org. It's quite a short document. And when we launched it in 2009, we didn't really know what we were going to do next. And suddenly, out of the woodwork, came actually not religious leaders, but businessmen. Businessmen in the United States, there's a whole group of them in Microsoft who came together and formed the Compassionate Action Network. In Pakistan, which has become one of the leaders of the Charter, Jordan, the Gulf states, and this was marvelous, not something I could ever have envisaged because I have the business head of a chicken. But nevertheless, it was wonderful for me because business people know how to take an idea out of the ether and turn it into a practical reality, and know how to run a project so that they test it, pilot it properly, don't overstimulate too many expectations, scale back expectations, and allow the thing to grow. Well, we're just about now to develop a global sort of governing body for the Charter based in various hubs around the world: Africa, South Africa, Europe. The Netherlands is particularly strong, you might be glad to hear. Better than my own native country, I have to say. The United States, Indonesia, Pakistan, Jordan, and Malaysia being the leaders at the moment. And we've developed a campaign to create cities of compassion around the world, which doesn't just mean that you put up a label to say we're a city of compassion. It has to be integrated practically. The mayor has to affirm it, the charter, and you have to work on a practical project each year that the community needs, maybe a legal problem or a problem of homelessness or health, something that is needed in the community. Pakistan is concentrating very much indeed on education to train the leaders of tomorrow. But it came, when I went around the world trying to promote the Charter, it became clear to me there was a lot of confusion about what it was. And when I was lecturing in the Netherlands a few years back, I specifically said that compassion does not mean feeling sorry for people. But in the Dutch newspaper, every time, I was told by my publisher the next morning that every time I said the word compassion, it was translated pity. And so I realized there was something needed to be done somehow to get people to see that compassion is much more than pity. What is it? Well, our Latin Greek word, compassio, it means to feel or experience or endure something with somebody else. To put yourself in another person's position. To feel with another person. That doesn't mean looking down on them with gracious pity, but to feel that you can look into your eyes. It's a great empathy, really. In Arabic, however, the word Rahman is related etymologically to the word for womb. And that brings up immediately the image of mother love. And that's an icon that worldwide is seen as when we are us at our most humane. But mother love is hard. A mother has to get up every night to her crying child, however she's feeling, and she has to put her own wants and desires and irritation to one side, and she has to take responsibility for that child at every second of the day. She has to know where that child is and be looking out for any danger that might come to it. Being at the ready to rush to it if it's in time of trouble. And then that cute little baby grows up and can become a horrible disappointment. But the mother doesn't give up. The mother goes on believing in that child until the end. It doesn't stop until death. Now, there's a Buddhist prayer that says, "Let us cherish all creatures as a mother her only child." We have to have that same care and responsibility for all creatures, not just our particular cronies, but for all creatures. That same, and the crucial word is responsibility, even when it's uncomfortable. We have to for everybody. In Buddhism, karuna, it's a feeling, and Buddhists cultivate it, particularly in meditation, training their minds to think benevolently of compassionate thoughts towards every single creature on the planet, omitting not a single creature from their radius of concern. And that means the difficult people close to you. It's sometimes easier to think benignly of people in far distant climes, and not so easy to think benignly about your ex-wife or your unpleasant boss or annoying sibling. But that's where you have to start too, because it has to start here. So it's a program of activity, and it's summed up very often, as I've said, in the Golden Rule: never treat others as you would not like to be treated yourself. Confucius, as far as we know, was the first person to enunciate the Golden Rule in a way that was written down some 500 years before Christ. And he's become a particular hero of mine, therefore, largely because he's so practical and down to earth. His way is something that anybody can practice without having to go off to a forest or become a great yogin or ascetic. His disciples asked him, "Master, which of your teachings can we put into practice all day and every day? And what is the single thread that runs through all your teachings and pulls it all together?" And Confucius spoke in the Chinese, he said, "Shu," which means likening to oneself. Look into your own heart, discover what gives you pain, and then refuse under any circumstance whatsoever to inflict that pain on anybody else. Never treat others as you would not like to be treated yourself. And notice that Confucius said we had to do this all day and every day. All day and every day, not just when we feel like it. In England, I'm sure you don't have this in Holland, but in England, we have a habit of saying when we've done something nice for somebody, well, that's my good deed for the day. As then we could then return for the next 23 hours to our usual bitterness, unkindness, and greed. No, all day and every day. And if you achieve this, you achieved a form of ecstasy. One of the reasons why they're so keen on compassion is that what holds us back from enlightenment, or God, or nirvana, or the Tao, or our best selves, is egocentricity, selfishness, self-preoccupation. The golden rule takes you outside that self-preoccupation. And if you do it all day and every day, there's a wonderful description of one of Confucius's, his favorite pupil, Yan Hui, who says that you achieve an ecstasy. That it's the practice of compassion all day and every day that is the fulfillment you seek. Chinese are not so interested in finding out what lies at the end of the journey, but they're more interested in creating a sacred ambit here on earth, making the secular sacred. And his disciples said, Master, how can we apply this to political life? Now, these people, they're all talking very politically. This was in the bad old days, before people learned that it was better to separate religion and politics. But Confucius hadn't given up. And he was living at the beginning of a period that's often called the period of the warring states, in which the Chinese states started for a period of 200 to 300 years fighting one another, eliminating one another with horrendous loss of life, until only one of them was left in 221 BCE, and that became the Chinese Empire. They were beginning it was a beginning of a horrendous project, state building. And Confucius said, was convinced that unless we learn to treat all peoples as we wish to be treated ourselves, human beings would destroy themselves. They looked around. One occasion, a city was destroyed, and 400 prisoners of war were buried alive. Now, our casualties today are much worse than that, of course, our civilian casualties. Now, so how can we give this, translate this into political life? It's quite simple, said Confucius. You wish to establish yourself, then seek to establish others. You want to turn your merits into account, then make sure that other people have the chance to turn their merits to account. Never treat others as you would not like to be treated yourself. When you go among the common people, behave as if you are in the presence of an important guest. Now, this is something we could and must translate somehow into practical politics, seeking not only to establish ourselves, but seeking also to establish others. Treating nations we sweep aside with disdain as if you were in the presence of an important guest. Because this is the only way we're going to have peace in a world where increasingly small groups are going to have the powers of destruction that were once only the preserve of the nation state. Because we are living in an interconnected world. We are bound together more closely than ever before. We're linked together economically. When markets go down in one part of the world, stocks fall all around the globe that day. When what happens in Afghanistan or Iraq today can have repercussions now in New York or London or Madrid tomorrow. We all face the same environmental catastrophe. We're linked together on the World Wide Web. A nasty remark about Islam goes straight down the web, right into the open mouths of the terrorists and extremists who can use it to prove that the West is incurably anti-Islamic. And so now for our own self-preservation, we have somehow to find a way of treating all peoples as we would wish to be treated ourselves. Well, when I would talk like this, people started saying, look, this is too hard. How do we do this? So I devised a 12-step program. And the resonance with Alcoholics Anonymous is quite deliberate. Because we're addicted to our likes and dislikes. We don't know what we'd do without the people we hate. They give us our sense of identity. And we actually, we depend on them like junkies. And I sometimes look, I see mutinous faces in the audience thinking, can't I ever say an unpleasant word about my boss again? But whole peoples, we do that too, because it bolsters our sense of esteem. But also sometimes when we make an unkind remark, and I have a very sharp tongue, so I know what I'm talking about. When we make an unkind remark, we sometimes get a kind of delighted buzz of self-congratulation, rather like the first drink of the evening. And so we can't just wean ourselves away from this addiction to our dislikes overnight. So I devised a 12-step program. And I'm not going to take you all through all 12 steps tonight. You'll be relieved to hear. But I'm just going to go hoving in straight away for number 7, which I think is particularly important. Step 7 is how little we know. Now, we're living in a very omniscient society. We get a lot of information on the web, and we're encouraged very much to spout forth on, maybe not in Holland, but certainly in the UK, chat shows, phone-ins, all kinds of discussion programs. And sometimes when you listen to some of these phone-ins and people are holding forth, if you happen to know something about the subject at hand, it becomes quite clear that the amount of reliable information could be comfortably contained on the back of a small postcard. And yet we are encouraged to expound. Now, my model here is not a particularly religious leader, but Socrates, founder of the Western rational tradition. When people came to talk to Socrates, they always thought they knew what they were talking about. But after half an hour of Socrates' relentless questioning, they found that they didn't know the first thing about such basic subjects as goodness or courage, even though the people who were discussing the courage were all veterans of the Peloponnesian War, including Socrates himself, and had all fought in battle. The end of each Socratic dialogue finishes with all the participants realizing that they know nothing at all. And there's a sense of bewilderment, aporia, unknowing, and unease. They've realized the utter fallibility of everything they think. And at that point, Socrates said, you have become a philosopher, because you are willing and ready to question every single one of your received opinions and the ideas you take for granted. On the last day of his life, Plato says, Socrates said, as he about to die, that he was wise in one respect only, that he knew nothing at all. And I think we need to divest ourselves of a lot of the way we speak. Just listen to the way we speak about one another sometime. Oh, well, the trouble with her is. As though you could sum up the extraordinary mystery of a human being in a single sentence. And we do it with whole peoples, whole traditions. The trouble with Islam is, as though you could, the multifarious nature of a tradition like that could be summed up in a single sentence. And somehow we cannot relate to one another in a global way or even in a personal way unless we begin to learn that we are in the presence of a mystery with each person that we encounter. That's why when Hindus greet one another, they join their hands and bow, because they are bowing to that divinity within each person. There's a passage in Hamlet, which by a British playwright called... I know you. I'm sure you all know the story, but just in case you're a little bit rusty, Hamlet is causing a great deal of trouble in the court of Denmark, and the king has set his two old friends, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, to spy on him. And it doesn't take long for Hamlet to realize what's going on. So one night he goes to Guildenstern and presents him with a pipe with a recorder and says, "I pray you play upon this pipe." And Guilden says, I can't, my lord. "Oh, there's nothing to it," says Hamlet. "Perfectly simple. It's as easy as lying," he says caustically. "You just blow down this tube, wiggle your fingers around, and out comes the music." And he goes on bullying an event, and Guilden says, "My lord, I have not the skill." "Why? Look you now," says Hamlet. "What a poor thing you would make of me. You would pull out all my stops. You would play me to the top of my bent. You would pluck out the heart of my mystery." And how often we pluck out the heart of the mystery of a human being with a single throwaway remark, or the particular genius of a civilization with a derogatory, ignorant remark. Simply to fulfill, as Rosencrantz and Guildenstern were, an agenda of their own, one's own. We can't afford this in our globalized world. The 12th century Sufi mystic Ibn Arabi said that every single one of us was a revelation of God's hidden name, one of God's hidden names. That every single one of us, whatever our religious tradition or lack of it, was an incarnation of an aspect of God. And that's meant to say that it's an exercise to say how little we know about God. Because if you think of just all of us in this room, for example, it would be impossible to sum up the immensity of God as a result of that. But also, said Ibn Arabi, it is our job to look beneath the frequently unpromising exterior with imagination and create epiphanies for ourselves by learning to see the divine, the sacred, the special, the uniqueness that exists in the heart of the person we're meeting. And he also said this, and he is talking here about religious chauvinism, thinking that your religion is the best. But I think it applies equally to any sort of entrenched view, any entrenched view or opinion. Do not praise your own faith so exclusively that you disbelieve all the rest. If you do this, you will miss much good. Nay, you'll fail to realize the real truth of the matter, God, the omniscient and omnipresent, cannot be confined in any one creed. For he says in the Quran, "Wheresoever ye turn, there is the face of Allah." Everybody praises what he knows. His God is his own creature, and in praising it, he praises himself. Consequently, he blames the beliefs of others, which he would not do if he were just, but his dislike is based on ignorance. And that ignorance of the fact that there is somehow a spark of the sacred, a spark of the divine, a spark of the unique in every single creature, that's what he called ignorance. And to let go of these entrenched opinions, which are basically simply projections of ourselves. Step 8. How should we speak to one another? Well, again, we're living in a very talkative age. Our airways are abuzz. God forbid we should go for a country walk or stroll by the sea without our mobiles. We talk a lot. Now, often, maybe not in Holland, but often in our discourse in the modern world, in our modern democratic world, our discourse is remarkably aggressive. In politics, in the media, in the law, even in academia. It's not enough for us to seek the truth. We also have to humiliate and defeat our opponents. And there's very little listening going on. We are very good at talking, we're not so good at listening. If you ever watch those, maybe you don't have them like this in Holland, but when on a panel discussion on television, when someone is holding forth, if you watch the others, they're not really listening to him, heart and soul. They're simply thinking of the next brilliant remark that they're going to make, to sort of put that dagger in. Now, Socrates, again, said that unless a debate, a dialogue, was conducted with gentleness and courtesy on each side, it was a non-dialogue. It had not worked. Nobody must be pushed into a position where he didn't want to go. At every point, you must take people with you so that they are in total accord. Everybody must express his opinion and have the ability to do so as fully and beautifully as he can, and the others must let it invade their consciousness and change it. Dialogue is one of the buzzwords of our time. We keep saying that if only we could open dialogue with somebody, peace would break out. But what we seem to mean by dialogue is simply bludgeoning our opponent to accept our opinion. There's no point in going into dialogue if you're not prepared to be changed by the encounter. That doesn't mean you cave in and go over lamely to the other side, but you let yourself be affected by what you hear. I was a member of a UN commission a few years back. This is the beginning of a project called the Alliance of Civilizations, and we were asked to document the causes of extremism. And we were 20 of us from all around the world. And one of the things we suggested was that there should be a new white paper in the Middle East, not like the old white papers of old, done in the Foreign Office in London, but it should be using modern techniques, modern videoing, to take people's narratives of pain, to take people's, while they're still alive, to hear their stories of suffering, and let these all be listened to on both sides. Because very often when people are saying what happens, if you're in these excruciating talks, when people have really been in pain, the other side will chip in and say, no, actually, it didn't happen like that, and start fighting about it. Now, any psychiatrist, or indeed any novelist, can tell you that the point of a narrative is not necessarily historical. What the person is saying is what has happened inside, and that's just as important. That pain has to be listened to. Unless we allow ourselves to listen to narratives of pain that may dislodge the good opinion we perhaps have of ourselves, we are not going to have peace in our world. We must, remember the Buddhists said, let yourself be affected by pain and take responsibility for it as a mother her only child. Because pain festers and goes bad. Now, it's very important for us always to speak out when there is something amiss. We must speak out when we see cruelty and injustice. But how do we speak to one another? I take Gandhi as my guide. Gandhi said that when you are about to condemn someone like the British, I think it was what he had in mind, you have, he said, to ask yourself what you are going to say actually going to help the matter, or do you wish to punish? Do you wish to hurt by what you say? So my checklist is St. Paul's letter on love. Charity is patient, is kind. Charity is, he said in one translation, is not puffed up. Puffed up. Sometimes when you see people inveighing against a particular disorder or a particular tradition, you can almost watch them swelling before your eyes with self-delighted congratulation. And St. Paul says, charity takes no pleasure in the wrongdoing of others. Some people are positively smacking their lips with delight, in self-righteous delight over the faults of others. This does no good, because from what I've studied of every fundamentalist movement that I have studied, for example, in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, always, historically, becomes more extreme when it's attacked. So if you want to ameliorate the situation, somehow we have to find a way of doing it that's not aggressive in this way, but that makes the point, but also does not just create a backlash. And be careful with what we say. Spouting off is not good enough. Now, finally, step 12, the hardest of all, love your enemies. These steps, this is not, this book was on the New York Times bestseller list for the how-to books. I didn't mind that, it is a how-to book, but it's a bit different from other how-to books, because it's not like getting slimmer thighs in 6 weeks or something. This is a lifetime project. We'll be working on it, as Confucius said, to our dying day. So don't be discouraged if you still feel you're at step 1, because this is a lifetime thing. But the hardest of all is love your enemies. Now, when Jesus said this, I want to do a bit of exegesis here. He was, and St. Matthew is presenting him on the Sermon on the Mount, doing a piece of rabbinic exegesis. Taking a piece of the Hebrew scripture and enlarging on it, changing it in some way, and turning it around. And so he says he's taking love your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus is saying, yes, love your neighbor, but take it a step further now, love your enemy also. Now, he's not talking about love in our sense. Our word, probably not like in Holland, but love in English has got so debased. Oh, I love ice cream. Didn't you love that movie? I love a gin and tonic. Now this he's not talking about affection either. The word, the Hebrew word in Leviticus is hesed. Leviticus is a legal term, and it's not talking about emotion. That would be as out of place as it would be in a Supreme Court ruling. This is hesed was a legal term used in international treaties when two kings would promise to form an alliance. They may have been former enemies, and to love one another. That didn't mean they fell into one another's arms, but that they would look out for each other practically. They would give, from henceforth, they would give each other practical help and support. They would come to their aid when in time of trouble. They would make sure that they would not allow their own selfishness and their own self-interest to impede their relationship with that person. This is the kind of love we must give even to our enemies if we want a viable world. And we need to spend a lot of time thinking how to do this. I'm going to finish now with the Greeks. The Greeks in the 5th century were enjoying their huge and wonderful rational Renaissance, but they also invented the genre of tragedy, where they put suffering on stage and made the audience empathize and look at a human being going through an extremity of agony. And everybody was obliged to come to these plays. It was a religious rite. It took place on the festival of Dionysus, god of transformation, and it was required of the citizen to go. It was a civic duty, because each of these plays, was often taking an old Greek myth, but changing it to make it reflect one of the problems that Athens was going through at this time. Periodically, when you're watching it was a civic meditation, really. Where are we going wrong? Where are we going? Periodically, the leader of the chorus would turn to the audience and say, "Now weep. Weep for Oedipus, a man who'd broken every taboo in the book. Weep for Heracles, who in a fit of divinely inspired anger had killed his wife and children." And the audience did weep. These people were presented as people with whom they did weep, because the Greeks felt that when people wept together, they created a bond between them. And they also felt that they were not alone in their pain. Every single one of us has pain that we wouldn't want necessarily to tell anybody about. But every single one of us has pain, and so when we, in that community, they felt that they were no longer alone in their suffering. Now, the first of these plays to come down to us was Aeschylus's The Persians. And it was written about 7 years after the landmark battle of Salamis, naval battle in which the Greeks had defeated the Persians. But before they did that, the Persians had rampaged through Athens and trashed it. They'd not destroyed all the beautiful new temples on the Acropolis. They'd burned, they'd looted, they'd just wrecked the city. And now Aeschylus is asking the Athenians to weep for the Persians. The Persians are presented as a people in mourning. Xerxes, the defeated hero, is brought back and conducted with great dignity into his palace. And sometimes I say, when I'm in America, now could you put on a play in Broadway after 9/11 and look at what's happened to the Muslim world since 9/11 and ask that makes the audience weep? And this is what our art should be doing, helping us to put ourselves in the shoes of the other. And this tradition goes back very, very deeply into the Greek tradition, this whole theme. And we find it in Homer, and this is my last story. In the Iliad, which, as you know, it tells the story of one small incident in the long 10-year war between the Greeks and the Trojans. And Achilles, the chief warrior on the Greek side, has a quarrel with his king. And in a fit of egotistic pique, he goes off and sulks in his tent and withdraws all his men, his own personal army, from the war. This is disastrous for the Greek side. And in the ensuing chaos, Achilles' beloved friend Patroclus is killed by Hector, one of the Trojan princes. And Achilles goes mad with rage. He's a tender-hearted man usually, but he goes berserk. He challenges Hector to a duel. And the two slug it out in front of both armies, and Hector's family, the royal family of Troy, are watching from the city walls. He kills, no one can beat Achilles, he kills Hector, and he mutilates the body by tying it to his chariot and driving it round and round Patroclus' grave. And then he does a terrible thing. He refuses to give Hector's body back to the family for burial. And that means that that Hector will never know rest. In the Greek world, that meant that he would wander disturbed, lonely, frightened, and afraid for all eternity because the rites had not been done. Well, one night into the Greek camp, in disguise, comes old King Priam, king of Troy, Hector's father. And he makes his way to Achilles' tent and he throws off his disguise. And everybody, of course, is quite shocked. The old man comes up and falls down in front of Achilles and embraces his knees and weeps, pleading for the body of his son. And Achilles looks at the old man and he remembers his own father and he begins to weep. And the two men weep together, Priam not only for Hector, but for all the other sons that Achilles has killed. And Homer says, Achilles weeps, now for his father, now for Patroclus. And they weep together, and that bond is created. There's silence, and Achilles goes and fetches Hector's body and lays it very tenderly in the old man's arms, very worried that the weight will be too much for him. And then, Homer tells us, each of these enemies looks at each other and each sees the other as divine. And that is when we become most godlike, when we realize that our enemies also have pain. Thank you.